All right, welcome. So happy that you all could join us today for our session. It is Wellness Wednesday. I'm so excited to invite you to take a short break with us, and we're going to focus on you, your wellness, your well-being, and your overall physical and mental health. That's because I've learned myself that without our health, we truly have nothing. I'm Ashley Bernardi, CEO of Nardi Media and Nardi Media Academy, and I'm thrilled today to have with us Dr. Samuel Mann. Dr. Mann is author of an amazing book, Hidden Within Us, Understanding the Mind-Body Connection. He delves deep into the intricate relationship between our minds and bodies, exploring how our thoughts, emotions, and physical well-being are all interconnected. I learned that myself through my own personal journey. Dr. Mann, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today on Wellness Wednesday.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, so let's just dive in. Since we're all taking this wellness break with you, could you provide us with an overview of your book, Hidden Within Us? What inspired you to explore the mind-body connection in such depth? Because it's truly revolutionary. There are not a lot of folks in the medical field doing that.
Right. Well, I'm a physician. I'm at Weill Cornell Medical College, New York Presbyterian Hospital. I'm as mainstream as they come. My specialty is hypertension, which was long considered by many to be a mind-body disorder. And decades of research studying every aspect of anger, anxiety, emotional distress, relaxation techniques, and it had led nowhere. And the conclusion after decades of research is they could not prove a mind-body connection. Well, we learn in medical school our best teachers are our patients. And I learned from my patients. And what I came to realize is something that not only is not mainstream, doesn't exist in medicine, an understanding it doesn't yet exist. And it relates the mind-body connection to our most powerful emotions, which happen to be emotions that we are unaware of. Unaware of because they have been repressed.
That's right.
And the good news is that repression is not psychopathology. Repression is one of the greatest gifts of evolution to mankind, meaning when facing overwhelming stress or trauma, the emotion is blocked from our awareness. It doesn't happen all the time, but in many. So what I learned from patients, for example, a patient who had severe spikes in blood pressure, hospitalizations, nothing in his current history. He was a Holocaust survivor. And when I asked him, with no other explanation, could it be related to that? He said, no, it never affected me emotionally.
Hmm.
And that's when I realized he had dealt with it by not dealing with it. It was repressed at an unconscious level, and he had led a good life, but now had a condition that nobody could explain. And that particular disorder, paroxysmal hypertension, episodic hypertension, there is no other explanation to date, no other treatment that can prevent recurrent episode after episode. And in the majority of patients, this understanding holds true and leads to effective treatment in about 90% of patients. And again, there's no other treatment. So this understanding, more importantly, pertains to a lot of other medical conditions. And there are so many medical conditions that to this day, we do not understand what triggers it. And we don't always have the greatest medication or treatment. And it's an understanding that does not exist in medicine and that my book is about, that my clinical experience forced me to write it and get that understanding out there.
Yeah, and Dr. Mann, it's truly like when we met, I was like, oh my gosh, I so relate to this with my own personal story, but it's revolutionary. Um, how like I'm just wondering, like, how has the medical community responded to your book? Given that it I see it as so groundbreaking and revolutionary and almost counterintuitive to what, we're told by working with doctors. What's been the response?
Well, there has to be resistance to the idea because it did not require any technology to understand, and yet nobody has noticed it. The
Yeah.
idea that we harbor powerful emotions that hide within us for years and decades. and that those powerful, long-lasting emotions logically could affect us much more than the emotions we're aware of. But it doesn't occur to anybody because we're unaware of those emotions. So I have colleagues I've been working with for decades, they still have trouble grasping it. And in the medical profession, this understanding does not yet exist. And yet psychologists fully understand this and applaud it. But these patients don't see psychologists because they don't have the emotional distress. So they wouldn't go to a psychologist. So it has
Because
to
they
be
don't have,
patient.
right, they don't have the current emotional distress. So like when you say, and like I can relate to this because I harbored the powerful emotion of grief for 20 years before I suffered from a health crisis that stopped me in my tracks. How can we, as you know, just like general public here in America, like sit back and say, okay, am I harboring these emotions? Like, how do we go on this path of discovery and get curious about, could this physical ailment be linked to some powerful emotion that I am harboring, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, it's a thought that would not occur to people because what happened 20 years ago, they just can't imagine it's affecting them. And that's
Right.
why I wrote the book where the cases bring out the understanding and also some of the evidence that backs this up. And for example, there are studies that for a number of medical conditions that we don't well understand, there's a relationship to childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Studies are there, but it's a matter of connecting what happened in the past and was repressed to medical conditions affecting us today. And it's hard to believe that there are powerful emotions that I don't feel at all. But
Mhm.
evolution gave us the ability to not feel, but those emotions are still there. So one has to be
So
open.
evolution is our greatest, but possibly enemy too.
It's a mixed blessing, and it gets us through
Right.
the unimaginable. It really does. If we don't repress, there's a good chance of psychological consequences. And it is amazing. And even if you look at books on emotional resilience, they do not even mention repression. They
Question.
talk about emotional support, family, faith. They don't mention repression. That's how foreign a concept it is. And research psychologists don't get it either. Clinical psychologists do. Research psychologists are into questionnaires and associations and statistics. Uh, Clinical psychologists fully understand this, but they don't see these patients because the repression has spared the patient the emotional consequences.
I see. Okay, so for those who are watching, individuals, you know, maybe CEOs, leaders, parents, anyone, how can we begin to cultivate a deeper awareness for our mind-body connection every day? Do you have some just like simple tips and takeaways for our viewers on this Wellness Wednesday?
Yeah, in my book, I mentioned several conditions. We're talking colitis, autoimmune diseases, migraine, chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndromes, where we don't really know the cause of them. And it's a matter of just being open to the possibility
Mm.
and asking, gee, is there a history? Do I have a past history of rough stuff that I've done very well with? There are also, even in the absence of overt trauma, uh, there are many people who nothing gets to them. They are super even keeled. We all know people like that.
Yeah.
And there too, it's called a repressive coping style. And it's a matter of being open. Well, in my history, is there a history of severe prolonged stress? Doesn't have to be trauma, but severe prolonged stress
Mhm.
that didn't get to me and I got through. I succeeded. I won. But do I have that history? And could that be contributing to this illness that nobody can fully understand?
So it starts with an individual truly getting curious about what that could be. Perhaps it's prolonged stress from a job or a relationship, right? So what I'm hearing is that getting curious is really the first thing to do? And then what could they do after, like if they do discover, like, oh, you know what? I was stressed for 3 years trying to get pregnant, trying to like anything. What would they do with that information, do you suggest?
Well, first thing is just to acknowledge, yes, I've been through rough times.
Mm,
Um, and it's also a matter of trusting one's own mind to get to it. And in treating it, there are two directions one can go. One is to get in touch with the emotions. And interestingly, that can happen very quickly. And even without psychotherapy, some people are open to it. On the other hand, severe trauma, maybe it's best not to get in touch with it because we don't know how it would affect us. And the
mhm.
good news is, if it's too rough to deal with, our mind that has kept it out of awareness for all this time is not going to let it up. We have to
Mm.
trust our mind. It does that. If the emotions come up, we can deal with them. And but it's a
So yeah, so emotions are safe, basically. It's like it's okay to feel them in a safe way.
right. And I think that's the most important thing to recognize. If my mind that protected me all these years from this emotion is now letting it in because I'm thinking about it, I can handle it. My
I
mind
love
won't fail me after all that.
I love that. And that's, I've personally learned that after bearing grief from my father's death for 20 years, and it came out 20 years later in physical distress. And now I give myself permission to feel my emotions in a safe way. I don't repress them. If I'm upset, I allow myself to be upset, and I find safe ways to just do so. But then there's also this just like the daily stress. And I can see anyone watching and listening being like, okay, so what about like the daily stress of like the balancing the housework with work and the kids? And is there a way that individuals can effectively manage stress to mitigate those negative effects that it has on the mind and body after prolonged repression?
Right. One term that one has to be careful about, two terms, difference between repression and suppression. In other words, I can have a rough day
Mm,
and put it out of my mind. Let me focus on that, take care of that, and not deal with it right now.
right.
And focus my attention on other things. That's a conscious process. I'm deciding I don't want to deal with it, or I'm grieving, but let me focus on work. And
Yeah,
my work helps get through it. And that doesn't mean one will not feel the grief, but maybe letting it in at a pace that one can tolerate it. Um,
mm,
Suppression of emotion is a very conscious mechanism. Yeah, I don't want to think about it. I know it's there, but I don't want to think about it. Repression, I don't even know the emotion is there.
right. Okay, those are two very important differentiators, and I think that's so important. So how do we excavate that repressed emotion? So yes, I see like, okay, yeah, I'm stressed, I'm going to put it to the side. But if we don't know that it's repressed, and as you said, it's like this protective mechanism that our body and evolution has, um, how do we discover it? Like, does it have like, because does it have to be through a physical ailment, or like, are there other ways to discover it beyond just getting physically sick?
Well, if somebody is doing well, life is good, and health is good, there's no reason to even think that there's anything going on beneath the surface. But when there are chronic conditions, um, emotional also. So in
Mm,
other words, another example, an immigrant who comes here, no language, no money, works 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for years and years, and handled it beautifully. Now, 20 years later, he's suffering from anxiety. Life is good, doesn't
mm,
make any sense.
mhm.
Those are emotions that are popping up that had been repressed when they needed to be repressed. And again, it's something that may be hard to understand, but again, repression served them. How do we get in touch? Um, I want to be clear. I'm not saying everybody who's a survivor of severe stress or trauma can or should get in touch. You have to trust the individual, but at
Right.
least offer the understanding. Um, there are medications that can be useful as an alternative. So, for example, in that Holocaust survivor, I was not going to ask him to get in touch with his feelings.
Yeah.
I gave him an antidepressant. He wasn't even depressed, but it pushed the emotions down and the episode stopped. And what's interesting is antidepressants may have a role in a lot of medical conditions in people who aren't depressed or anxious, who would never be offered it.
Wow.
All this needs to be studied because it doesn't exist in medical thinking or medical research.
Well, let's talk about that because I'm curious what you're hoping to see how the medical field advances in mind body medicine. Like what are you hoping? What advancements and developments would you like to see in the medical field as it relates to mind body medicine?
Right? There needs to be more studies um, identifying, and there are studies already that have identified a history of trauma, history of childhood adverse events
Mm,
is more likely in patients with a number of medical conditions. A beautiful example is chronic fatigue syndrome. Nobody knows the cause in almost all patients. Nobody knows. But studies show there are two things. One, the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight reflex, our
mhm.
emotions. Sympathetic tone in chronic fatigue, every study shows that it's increased and nobody understands why. Second thing is in chronic fatigue syndrome, there's a much higher incidence of adverse childhood events.
Mhm.
And first thing we need to do is make that connection, studies to look at that connection in other conditions, studies to look at the response to that understanding in some patients, and studies to consider new treatment approaches, for example, antidepressants, for example, medications that target the sympathetic nervous system, which indirectly gets at the emotions. All that needs to be done to begin to understand the impact of this understanding.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like there is a lot of work to be done in the medical field. And that's why, Sam, I'm so grateful that you've written this book and that we've been introduced because you are one of the first in like Western medicine that has that I have heard talk about the mind body connection with repressed emotions. So I'm curious for readers when they read your book, when they pick up Hidden Within Us, what are you hoping that they take away and how do you envision them making it a positive impact on their lives?
First of all, this will be the first time it ever occurred to them that events from the past might be affecting their health today. Secondly, it's an understanding that, hey, that child that I was, what he went through, and relate to that child, connect to that child within you. And it's not something that would occur to us, but we have empathy for other people. We need empathy for the child that carried us through rough times.
Oh,
And actually, we need more empathy externally as well, but also to that child. I have some patients, I ask them to write a letter to that child and tell them they will be
mm.
all right. And, don't let time be a factor. It's never too late to reassure that child.
Oh, Sam, that's so beautiful. And I can personally relate to that. I want to go write a letter to the, young Ashley who was 11 years old and lost her father. I feel like a lot of our listeners and viewers can relate to this. So just that was beautiful. Tell everyone where we can find more information about you and the great work that you're doing and your book.
Well, medically, I'm a specialist in hypertension, and um, I'm not a psychologist, but I only see the patients with difficult or hard to control hypertension, and it is a challenge, and it's a nice specialty because one can succeed in almost all cases, which makes it very emotionally rewarding. As far as the mind-body, my book, Hidden Within Us, A Radical New Understanding of the Mind-Body Connection, includes a number of medical conditions. It's written in English and not in psychobabble and not in poorly understandable medical jargon. It conveys the understanding. I literally tell patients, you are in the book, and they see it because they connect with one or two or more of the patient stories in the book to convey this understanding and hopefully begin to open the door to healing. And in some patients, that understanding can come very quickly. Oh my gosh, I never realized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure there's just powerful shifts that happen and healing that happens too, just from this discovery of repressed emotions. Sam, I just want to thank you so much for taking time with me and with all of our Nardi Media fans and followers today on Wellness Wednesday. It is I just love your book so much, and I'm so grateful that we've been introduced. And I just want to say to you, keep sharing your message because the world needs to hear it. Don't stop and keep talking about it. And I'm hopeful too that the medical field and industry will continue to evolve and advance in this way as well. So thank you so much, Sam, for being here today.
Thank you, Ashley.
All right, everyone. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. Take some time for you today. Maybe write that note to your younger self and tell yourself everything is going to be okay. And look where you are today. You can find more information about Nardi Media at nardimedia.com and also nardimediaacademy.com. Thank you again, and we will see you soon.